Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we're a law firm that works solely on technology, cybersecurity, and legal issues. In each episode, we look at stories in the law relating to digital technology from around the world, with an emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Rice. We're just going to run through some of the news stories that have been coming up this week. So I will pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we are a law firm that specialises in issues around the legal aspects of the use of digital technologies. I think from mobile apps to data protection to cybersecurity to selling highly regulated goods and services in different countries using digital technology. And on that basis, we've got just focusing on a couple of big stories for this episode. So I'll pass back to Amelia to kick things off.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, like you've just said, kind of this episode does very much focus on ransomware. And so ransomware is a massive criminal industry worth over 20 billion a year globally. And criminals charge victims for access to their data and promise not to publish once they've been hacked. They have recently shut down hospitals, energy supplies, and grocery chains, and therefore, faced with crisis, scared companies will pay out to stop the data from being released. And actually, it's perfectly legal for them to pay out at the moment. So British companies are also the most likely to hand over a ransom, with over 82% of UK victims doing so, which is against a global average of 58%, according to the company Proof Points. But paying only encourages more ransomware. So you've got kind of a catch-22 here, Peter.
Absolutely, and I think part of the problem as well is that when it comes to securing data, when it comes to looking at issues around security and technology and how organizations operate, increasingly we find that companies end up just putting this in the box that is too difficult. It's like, oh, this is going to be difficult, it's going to be expensive, we don't know what to do, so let's just carry on doing what we're doing. And I think in particular when the UK is currently in a technical recession, when profitability has been cut to the bone, when organizations are looking to cut costs where possible. Regrettably, having some basic security measures in place to guard against ransomware is becoming something that is simply not being invested in, which makes the fact that then we've got 82% of UK corporations paying out when it comes to ransomware. That unfortunately that figure is not surprising. There's the element of, as well, people seem to think, oh, well, at least if we pay, we'll get the data back. Well, there's no guarantee that you get the data back. It is the easy solution to pay the ransom, given that very often insurers will pay the ransom under a cyber liability policy that you may have. But, as always, check the wording. So often it is the case that actually you think this is going to be covered by your insurance, you pay the ransom, and then find that, surprise, surprise, the insurer won't actually cover you for it. So I think that's sometimes an incredibly dangerous assumption to make in terms of presuming that the insurer will help you out of a difficult situation.
So we're talking about the payment here. Kind of the question arises, why is payment allowed? Why hasn't there been a ban put in place? But realistically, we're looking at inertia. No government has undertaken a formal analysis of the ban. And also kind of thinking internationally, the US is reluctant to stop companies paying their way out of trouble. And the rest of the world is sort of refusing to challenge this. Because realistically, we're talking about victims where they're kind of key services. We're talking about hospitals, other supply chains, energy stores. We're talking about really key services that if paying the ransom is kind of the quicker and comparatively easy solution, I'm using quotation marks, then why shouldn't they be paying? But
I think the thing is that the more you pay, then the more that businesses will be targeted. And it is not unknown, of course, if you just pay the ransom, they can probably still get back into your system and exploit you again multiple different times. And this has happened where it gets to the point that then hackers end up carrying out multiple different attacks on the same victim. So you end up paying the ransom multiple times. because you've not worked out what the vulnerability was that the hackers exploited in the first place. There is also, I think, an assumption that, oh, well, we do this and then the problem goes away and we get the data back. And it's almost thinking we don't then, particularly if it's personal data we're talking about, the victim will think, oh, well, we don't actually have to report this now to the ICO. Well, guess what? If hackers had access to your data and could see it, you still have to report it because a third party has had access to that personal data. So it's not a sort of a way out of dealing with the difficulty of the Information Commissioner's Office or any other European data protection regulator, depending where your company operates and where you might have offices and where you might be operating. You still have to report this under GDPR. It's not like, I think there's sometimes some confusion that if you're in America, very often the first thing is, well, can we just hush this up and not tell anyone? Because that's the default position in the States. You only have to report if you've been hacked to the markets. If, for example, you're a publicly traded company with shares, because it would impact on your share price. But if you're not a publicly traded company, the presumption is keep stum, don't tell anyone. It is not the case under European and UK data protection law. You have to report these things to a regulator. So there's almost this assumption sometimes that people look at what happens in the States and go, oh, well, if we just pay and then it'll make this all go away and we don't have to do any of this tedious reporting things to the regulator and then getting fined for the potentially fined for the privilege. And that simply isn't the case, but it's because people are looking at US guidance, which simply isn't applicable in the UK.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of private companies in the US there. And actually, American hospitals get hacked far more than comparatively the NHS. And that's because as a private company, they're more likely to pay because, like you've said, if they're private or publicly traded, you have got much more of an impact on specifically what could happen to the data and also public opinion of the company itself.
Exactly. So, I mean, you're going to be much more unlikely to trust a company with your data and being able to safely deliver a service and look after your records. You're going to be that trust will be fatally undermined if you hear of a significant cyber attack that organisation has sustained. And it's absolutely right that yes, American hospitals very often are hacked certainly more easily, we should say. Their systems can be quite labyrinthine and Byzantine for that matter. So sort of based on much older technology at its core that can be potentially compromised because they won't have invested in probably updating those systems potentially. Interestingly, the NHS doesn't have a particularly great record when it comes to IT, but they have learned from their experience of being on the receiving end of the WannaCry ransomware attack back in 2017, which has meant that since then they now have rudimentary measures in place. And also the fact that when they were hacked, they didn't pay the ransom means that hackers have thought, well, okay, we should probably try, it's not really worth trying to exploit government entities, given that generally those sort of public sector bodies are less likely to pay a ransom than a private company.
And so it's interesting that we're kind of thinking then more internationally here because Australia recently consulted on introducing a ban, but delayed the measures for 2 years after concluding that industries needed to be more resilient to attacks. So we've kind of got a two-pronged approach thinking about Australia here. The fact that, like you said, people need to have rudimentary measures in place in terms of cybersecurity because there are some fairly comparatively easy steps that can be done and fairly cost effectively anyway that can help to mitigate and prevent ransomware attacks. But equally at the same time, where people are paying, you are feeding the beast.
Exactly, and hence the proliferation of ransomware. And it's interesting that the former head of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre that has put a leader in the Times newspaper this week, as well as trying to sort of speak up on this issue and saying that it really is important to try and ram home the point that we shouldn't be feeding the beast in the same way we shouldn't be feeding the trolls. And he actually draws some similarities to the fact that, for example, many governments have a policy of not, they do not negotiate with terrorists and they will not pay terrorists. And he's arguing that the same position should be taken by companies and organisations, both in the public and private sector as a whole. Hence, Australia looking at this ban, finding that they think there isn't a sufficient level of resilience there yet, sort of leaving things for 2 years, in theory, to allow organisations to become more resilient before potentially introducing a ban on the payment of these ransoms, which is seen as the only way, really, of reducing the flow of money to the hackers, which only then serves to embolden them even further.
Comparatively, though, the FBI has said that it fears that if payments were banned, companies would still pay ransoms, but without calling in the authorities, and in doing so would further expose themselves to blackmail. So again, you've got potential issue there. But I guess another argument could be that realistically, companies would then rather not paint themselves as criminals during this when they are obviously going to be a victim of a cyber attack.
You would hope.
You would, but I mean, there we are.
Yeah.
We'll leave the rest of the imagination there.
Indeed. I mean, I get the point that it actually, if you do say, right, we're going to have a ban in legislation, and you have it on the statute book saying that companies should, or any organisation that's hacked shouldn't then pay the ransom, it does leave the question of, well, how do you enforce that? Do you look at a regulator? So someone like the NCSC having an arm that actually will then reach out to companies and where if they find out that actually a ransom has been paid, that they would then take further action against that company. That, you know, are we saying that companies and organisations have already been victims of a cyber attack? Are they then going to face regulatory investigation and enforcement? Imagine the cost of that to the state when states, public sectors are already overly stretched, not well funded enough. Is it then the case where saying, well, they actually now would be required to do this? Is it going to be hitting those organisations that have been hacked even more? That probably isn't going to be particularly effective. But arguably, would you need a big stick to get organisations in line behind a ban and stop those payments being made? But you can see the point conversely that when you've got almost 80% of organisations paying ransoms, that clearly something has to be done. Whether it's the draconian introduction and enforcement of a ban that is necessary, perhaps we need to have a bit more careful consideration, but arguably something needs to be done, and perhaps it does have to be something that draconian to actually get that figure down from those current levels, because that's a massive drag and a brake on the economy and a brake on organisations' profitability if such huge amounts are routinely going out the door paying ransoms to hackers.
Then on the other hand, if you then were paying those huge amounts into bolstering your own cybersecurity defences, what would also then happen? You know, if you had that money to throw at a problem, you know,
if only.
There we are. But we are kind of speculating somewhat there. Moving somewhat away from ransomware and into more kind of scams, we're next looking at pig butchering. Sounds bloody and fairly gory, but it is not your classic pig butchering at an abattoir.
No.
We are talking about the victims in pig butchering schemes. So essentially, pigs are the victim, essentially. Yes. Here. So the scammers will use elaborate storylines to fatten up the victims, the pigs, believing that are in a romantic or close relationship. And then once the victim places enough trust in the scammer, they bring the victim into a cryptocurrency investment scheme. Then comes the butchering, meaning that they'll be bled dry of all their money. So this sounds pretty scary on the outset.
Yeah. You should also point out as well that it's not just private individuals that can be the victim of these sorts of scams. There was one community bank in America where the chief executive of the bank was basically deceived by a scheme just like this, and the bank lost $50 million and had to close. So this isn't just someone who can be confused by the technology and easily swayed by a classic email scam and wiring money somewhere that they shouldn't have done. We're talking about something far more sophisticated that has, within the last few years, deceived people who really, they would have applied their usual sort of professional expertise and due diligence, say if they work in something like financial services, like that chief executive, and it was enough to scam and confuse them.
Well, that's just it. So, Peter, when we were discussing this story earlier, I've read some of the kind of potential messages that had been sent.
Mm.
And like you just said, it's not necessarily like the typical scam messages because
No.
on this podcast, we've talked a lot about the scam messages like, Mum, I've just using my friend's phone. I need X, Y, Z of money to be able to get a taxi home tonight. Again, it's a fairly targeted scam. But here it can be just as simple as someone sending a message looking like it's intended for someone else.
Yes.
For example, it could be, if it was someone messaging you, Peter, it could be, "Hi, Morgan, thank you for the job interview today. We'd like you to start X, Y, and Z." And for one, you're not called Morgan. And two, I don't think you'll be starting a new job.
Indeed. And I do receive the occasional message like that, which I always ignore. And that's just it. The thing on this is don't reply, don't start a conversation, because what the fraudsters are looking to do in this instance is, even if that initial attempt to sort of make first contact is blatantly off beam, they will then use that to go, "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to contact you," and then try and get into a conversation to see if they can somehow sort of begin a dialogue, almost to be friendly, and then from there try and inveigle the recipient of that communication to then entering into a scheme that they can use to sort of make the victim think, oh, this is actually a choice that they're making, of their own free will, and furthermore, not that they're actually transferring the money anywhere to a clear sort of other organisation or fraudster, but actually think that they're making a sound, reasoned investment that they are in perfectly clear control of. And that's the sort of unique difference on this. And it's interesting that it became more popular, given fraudsters started doing it in a really big way during the COVID pandemic and during the lockdowns, when people were socially isolated and were more potentially open to responding to an unsolicited text, because people were sort of locked up and potentially being starved of human contact. So the idea of just that new discussion did seem appealing to people, and it seems to have built from there, really.
And you can understand why as well. What could start off as like fairly simple interaction can then mean, oh, thinking about the pandemic, you're like, oh, crikey, someone new to talk to that's not, my folks or my partner. And then you have got that back and forth. And at the same time, you're then kind of putting extra and additional trust into that other person, which can leave you down the rabbit hole until, okay, if they throw into conversation that they're a successful entrepreneur and have got fake credentials which say the same, then you are going to be more likely to trust someone because you have built up what you would think is a really good relationship with them.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's an element. I mean, the fraudsters did have quite well developed psychological playbooks where they would just try to develop confidence with someone, in particular if it's a man, just making it look like they are talking to a female who might be interested in them and is, listens and pays them compliments. That would get them in. I mean, it was interesting actually that some of the, conversely, the fraudsters who were then speaking to females, it was interesting how very often all the fraudster had to do was actually listen to what the victim was saying and then respond based on that, rather than talking about themselves. Men are often genuine. People are often likely to do on different dating apps and social networks, meant that actually, women were taken in because they're like, oh, actually, this is someone genuine and someone who is actually genuinely listening to me, rather than just banging on about themselves. That says something else about human nature, but there you go. What the point is that's why these scams have been so very successful, and there are people who've been cheated out of their life savings, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And as I say, and this is where we should actually say, well, what's the actual end goal on this? What's the actual scam that they're trying to get people into? And it turns out that, surprise, surprise, it's centered on cryptocurrency.
And that's just it. I mean, cryptocurrency, as we've discussed over the years on this podcast, we've discussed the ups and the downs and well, at the moment, the downs, and how much
Well,
of
you
an
say
impact
that
this has on people.
Bitcoin's currently valued again at $60,000 per Bitcoin, and it's nearing a record high. So even
Oh,
now, after the market crashed and fell through the floor a couple of years ago, it has rebuilt and it's gone up and down, and it's now back almost to a record high again. Incredibly.
exactly. And that's very interesting in the sense of the fact that, okay, if people see this, are they going to be more taken in by future scams saying, oh, invest in this cryptocurrency? You kind of got to catch 22 there if
Yeah,
this market's growing, and then therefore more people are getting scammed,
yeah.
and it kind of goes in an endless circle.
Exactly. And in this instance, what happens is that rather than if we think of the old classic one where it was, oh, I seem to be short of monies and can you wire me some money? Instead, in this instance, the fraudster will have tried to sort of demonstrate their entrepreneurial success or the fact that they are, living a good lifestyle and that, it's based on an income they've developed from cryptocurrency or from a successful cryptocurrency investment. And then what they will do is say, oh, well, why don't you open your own account on such and such a platform? It's really good.
You've got a lovely bit of an illusion of control there as well.
Exactly. So the idea is that it's not like a link is sent saying download the app. They will direct the user to a seemingly genuine app that is up on Apple or Google Play. Download the app. It looks like a cryptocurrency trading platform. It could incorporate genuine APIs with real-time financial data on there. So you could be looking and thinking, well, actually, this is showing real-time data in terms of variations of how these currencies are being traded. It looks genuine. So, for example, you might be able to look and say, oh, yeah, Bitcoin's trading highly, which you've already heard, and you look on this app and you see that reflected and think, oh, this is perfectly legitimate. As is often the case, you end up having to, of course, put in your own money first. So, victim goes and puts a stake on there, and then they won't report it because, according to the app, it will look like this investment is doing phenomenally well. They may have put in a few $1,000s, and before they know it, the app is telling them that investment is now 5 or 6 times its original size, and it's doing incredibly well. And of course, the idea is then that the victim thinks, oh, this is really good. I'll put some more in. I'll put some more in. Oh, I will suggest this to a friend or family member, and they'll put in even more, which is exactly what happens.
Yeah. And
So,
hence the term, pig butchering. You've got the fattened up
yeah,
victim that thinks this is a fabulous,
yeah.
fabulous thing to invest in. And then all of a sudden, not only are they blood drive their money, but so are surrounding friends and family members.
Yeah, and of course, people only work out it's a scam when they then try and take their money out. One of these platforms, apparently, what happens is you try and cash out, as it were, to take your money back. Well, take out what you think is your investment, take that back, and then it will say, oh, tax due several $100,000, which it isn't. But that's really just an attempt to get some last money out of the fattened pig, because the reality is they're not getting any money out of that platform, and if anything, it's then trying to get you to pay even more on the promise of getting your money out. But the problem, of course, then is the minute that people realise what they've done, who's going to want to admit it? So
Mm-hmm.
even though there are stats out there in terms of how prevalent these pig butchering scams are, there is a suspicion that this is the tip of the iceberg because people are not reporting it. People are simply too ashamed and mortified that they've been tricked into paying when it is a very sophisticated and very well thought out scam being operated by very well resourced criminal gangs in the Far East.
And while obviously we've spoken a lot over the last kind of couple of minutes about the scam in itself, it is important for us to mention as well, if you do have a text message that you think is a scam, most phone providers are part of a scheme that allows customers to report suspicious text messages for free by forwarding it to 7726. And once you've forwarded this, your provider can investigate the origins of the text and arrange to block or ban the sender if it's found to be malicious. And
Yeah.
I myself, I found recently, at least once a week, I'm getting a random text message about, is it Hermes or no, what are they now? Every, that's it.
Yeah.
Every delivery. And I'm like, oh, crikey, I've not ordered anything for, a couple of months. That's absolutely a scam. And every time, you just send it to 7726 and they'll deal with it from there. And that's one of the kind of fairly quick and easy ways that you can at least try and help others and prevent possible scams from happening.
Yeah. And that's just it. We are now being, I think, bombarded with this stuff on such a regular basis. You almost become inured to it. I mean, that's not to say that the other sorts of scams, where it's please click on this link and that will then give authority to control over your phone, is still a big problem. I received a automated call today that said, "Oh, your credit card is subject to two payments, one for £400 and another for £1,500. If these weren't your transactions, please press this number." And it was designed so that you'd think. I mean, obviously, it's designed to panic you first of all, so you don't listen. But I immediately put the phone down and then thought about what had been said. And the point was, it didn't refer to, a credit card provided by a financial institution. It just said your Visa, because that isn't how it operates. It would be your Visa provided by another bank that would be the genuine thing. But as always, they're just trying to bounce you and panic you into doing something. And in this instance, if it then, if you didn't carry out these transactions, please press 1. That's what they're hoping you do, to press 1, and then who knows what would happen. Probably put you through to someone who then says, "Oh, yes, I'll have to take you through security. Please provide the information." Yeah.
The story almost writes itself at that point.
Yes.
I think that brings us to a nice kind of close on that one. That, be aware that scam messages are still around. We are a couple of years outside of the pandemic, but it does not mean that these scams are not still prevalent. And actually, there are some really great tools out there to, one, kind of how to train you on how to recognize scams, and two, quite easy ways to report scam messages.
Yeah, exactly. There are free tools there on the National Cybersecurity Centre.
Exactly.
We've paid for them all through the taxes, so we might as well use them.
And just to kind of round off our podcast today, it goes without mentioning that the UK regulator, the ICO, and the National Cybersecurity Centre previously in 2022 sent a letter to the Law Society of England and Wales reminding its members that they should not advise clients to pay ransomware demands should they fall victim to a cyber attack. So going back to our first story, Peter, why do you think today this is still so relevant?
Well, and the interesting thing is that letter, well, it wasn't just law firms, if you're hacked, would you mind not paying the ransom? It was, would you please desist from advising your clients that they should pay the ransom?
Exactly.
And I have spoken on panels where other lawyers have said, "Oh, well, there are good reasons why you should be paying the ransom," and you just leave yourself, banging your head against a brick wall. And you're like, well, if there was a good reason, I'm pretty sure that the ICO and the NCSC would have pointed it out. So you might have a wonderful sounding argument from a point of liability and security and what you think is good advice. But for the love of God, and if you've just listened to our discussion for the duration of this episode, let alone our previous episodes, there really is no good reason why organisations should be paying ransoms to ransomware hackers. Full stop, end of. And if it wasn't the case, well, they wouldn't have sent that letter to the Law Society and the Bar Council, would they?
Absolutely not. And to kind of add more fuel on that fire, the ICO has clarified that it will not take any payment into account when looking at mitigating factors and considering the type of scale of enforcement on action. Therefore, as a result, you may well have just paid out this great big sum to a hacker because, you want to get your data back. But after all, as Peter mentioned earlier today, it is still a breach. Therefore, you should still be reporting this to the ICO. However, they will turn around and likely give you a further slap on the wrist for paying the ransomware in the first place.
Yeah,
so it's kind of a lose-lose.
Exactly. They will not see payment of a ransom as mitigation in any way, shape or form. Furthermore, if you then paid the ransom and tried to convince yourself that there's no actual need to report this to either the ICO or any other regulator, such as the Bar Standards Board or the Systems Regulatory Authority, they're likely to take a very dim view of your conduct, and therefore regulatory enforcement from any of those regulators is much more likely.
Thanks, Peter. So that is our final story of this episode. But if you would like to hear more from us, including subscribing to our newsletter, as well as receiving information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you again to Anson Evaluate for helping us to produce this podcast. And if you'd like to produce your own podcast webinar, or you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. These episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon and Google Podcasts, and please feel free to leave us a review. And if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to speak to you again next week.